So this paper is part of a much larger project in which I focus on the Omani Empire under Sayyid bin Sultan and argue that his empire was a crucial yet overlooked space in the formation of modern global capitalism. And I can talk about more how I use capitalism in the Q&A if you like. If historians want to understand capitalism in a more comprehensive way, I challenge, we ought to look as much to places like Muscat or Zanzibar as England or New England. One theme to emerge from my research has been the striking degree to which the British Empire relied upon the Omanis. In this paper, then, I challenge notions of British dominance in the Western Indian Ocean in the first half of the 19th century. Instead, I argue that the British were aware of their own relative weakness and inability to compete with the commercial prowess of American entrepreneurs in East Africa. I demonstrate how the Americans' commercial approach to Sayyid meshed with his own proclivities as a merchant, providing the foundation for a thriving network of trade stretching from New England to Zanzibar. I reconstruct how Americans in East Africa acted as entrepreneurs, like Sayyid himself was, allowing them to best the British, who approached the region almost exclusively through the lens of abolition. I thus also reconstruct Sayyid's agency in managing the Anglo-American rivalry and highlight his remarkable skill at playing foreign powers off each other for his own gain. I'll begin then with some very, very brief historiography. Foremost in my mind has been Professor Alpers's call, back in 2002, I think, for Indian Ocean historians to think of the space and its history in more imaginative ways. If we're to think in new ways, we first have to identify the shared variables in the historiography. And one of those variables is that historians continue to interpret the space through the lens of British hegemony. As one Indian historian put it, the history of the Indian Ocean has almost always been told from a single originary point, that of the establishment of British stewardship of the ocean in the 19th century. Granted, the whole idea of the Vasco da Gama epoch has been challenged. Kenneth McPherson and Michael Pearson, for example, have demonstrated how at least until 1700, no European power was able to break the coherence of the Indian Ocean world. Despite this, however, those same historians concede that after 1700, quote, the relative economic self-sufficiency of the Indian Ocean economies was broken down, leading to the transformation of the Indian Ocean world into a dependent economic region of a capitalist-dominated world economy. Michael Pearson cemented his view on this, saying that the central fact of the modern Indian Ocean was British domination. Such statements belie a history far more complicated and tangled than one that can simply be construed in a unidimensional narrative of British domination. Historians like Niall Green or Sima Alawi or Sugara Bose have challenged this by highlighting the agency of Indian Ocean actors, but amplifying the movements, actions, and voices of Indian Ocean peoples has been cast within the framework of counter-hegemonic discourses. In other words, historians have sought to transcend the single originary point of British hegemony by showing how certain people exerted or maintained their agency despite British hegemony, but British hegemony nonetheless remains the analytical point of departure. So my answer to Professor Alpers's call to think more imaginatively is to do away with British hegemony as a starting point for crafting this history. In the age of Sayyid bin Sultan, the dominant structures of power controlling social, political, and commercial life in the Western Indian Ocean remained Omani, not British. To begin our particular story then, I turn to two paintings. When Edmund Roberts was sent in 1833 to Muscat to ratify the new American treaty with Sayyid, one member of his delegation described how, hanging prominently in the room Sayyid reserved for diplomatic meetings, were two prints depicting dramatic scenes of American naval victories over the British in the War of 1812. The defeats had humiliated the British. An article in the London Times had reflected British thinking on their fast emerging rival, saying, "It is not merely that an English frigate has been taken, but that it has been taken by a new enemy, an enemy unaccustomed to such triumphs and likely to be rendered insolent and confident by them." When the British learned that the Americans had signed a commercial treaty with Sayyid, this concern grew stronger. One official sought to placate the fear, harping that despite the new treaty, quote, the trifling trade which the Americans may carry on in their small vessels, end quote, could never interfere with the Crown's grand designs for the region. A decade later, in the 1840s, Britain's subordinate position had become clear. In 1841, when Atkins Hamilton was sent to Zanzibar as the first British consul there, he fumed in a letter to his superiors how, in his first meeting with Sayyid as consul, he had noticed in Sayyid's palace, in richly gilt frames, 2 scenes of British naval defeats to the Americans. In the same letter, Hamilton lamented, quote, "I am sorry to inform your excellency that our influence at Zanzibar is at the lowest possible scale, there being a strong party in favor of the French and American interests, and more particularly the latter," end quote. One of the reasons why there was favor for the Americans over the British can be seen in the person of their respective consuls. Richard Waters, the American consul, was a leading New England merchant and entrepreneur. He saw the world through a commercial lens. Atkins Hamilton, on the other hand, was a career military officer. He saw the world through the lens of the crown, and that meant abolishing the slave trade, in turn augmenting the British military. By the time Waters arrived in Zanzibar, the Americans had already been dominating trade there for years. Between September 1832 and May 1835, 32 American vessels docked in Zanzibar, totaling nearly 5,500 tons of goods. In that same period, only 7 British vessels docked, totaling only about 1,500 tons of goods. The Americans continued trouncing the Brits well into the 1850s. In 1859, for example, only 1 British vessel docked in Zanzibar, carrying only 493 pounds of goods. That same year, 35 American vessels docked, carrying more than 10,000 pounds of goods, and this was no exception. In the 4 years preceding that, only 11 British vessels went to Zanzibar, carrying 4,000 pounds of goods, whereas 119 American vessels docked, carrying nearly 40,000 pounds of goods. So just as that Times of London article had predicted, the Americans had indeed become rather cocky competitors to the Brits. In 1834, a British officer was sent to Zanzibar to gather intelligence on the state of commerce there in the wake of the new American treaty. During this officer's visit, several American ships docked, each on its second trip to Zanzibar. The British officer questioned the American traders, apparently challenging their commercial position, telling them that they had lost the market before they even knew it. One of the American traders belligerently responded, "Well, if we have lost the trade, we have had it for these last 14 years. While the English were too stupid to find it out, they never thought a Yankee could do so." Americans had the trade because they approached East Africa as a space for entrepreneurial enterprise. In fact, a French naval officer who spent several years in Zanzibar and Muscat made an astute observation when he noted that Richard Waters was more than just a consul. The Frenchman wrote that he had a triple job. He was a consul, a manager of a wealthy trading house, and a consignee of all American vessels docking in Sayyid's domains. American merchants, viewing places like East Africa as newly opened spaces for enterprise, were more than just traders. They were early venture capitalists. Waters' own job as a consul capitalist meshed with Sayyid's own self-described job as a merchant prince, and they grew to be dear friends. In the paper, I parsed through documents from many leading New England merchants to show how they used Waters to act as an insurance broker, a quality control manager, and even a middleman for connecting them to the best local Indian and East African merchants throughout the region. As a seasoned merchant, Waters masterfully tilted the market in America's favor, and despite a few rocky moments with the customs master, outmaneuvered the Brits to create an almost complete monopoly and to augment local East African demand for American goods, not British. One of the reasons that the Americans outdid the British was that until 1841, the Brits did not even have a consul in Zanzibar. The British were slow to recognize the emerging importance of East Africa as a commercial powerhouse. The American treaty was thus a wake-up call for many. In 1834, just after the ratification, one British officer fumed to Lord Palmerston, quote, "Shall we still refuse to reopen to our fair enterprise those countries which aforetime furnished even to Solomon his ivory, his pearls, and his gold?" End quote. His exhortations changed little, for even in 1838, there was one British official living in Zanzibar, and he wrote to Bombay, complaining how British traders were at a considerable disadvantage because they did not have a consul nor even a sizable presence in Zanzibar. British officials warned that the Americans were so dominant in East Africa that they were even selling East African goods like ivory in Great Britain. And perhaps even more insolent, they were importing goods into India and Persia using British-owned vessels. It's crucial to point out that Sayyid never even approached Britain for a commercial for a commercial treaty. In the paper, I note how they finally did ratify one in 1839, although it really had more to do with the slave trade than with commerce. When Hamilton arrived, he was dismayed at what he saw. He acknowledged Britain's subordinate position, as I previously quoted, and stated, quote, "The whole trade of Zanzibar is at present monopolized by the Banyan inhabitants and American settlers," end quote. Waters's role as a consul capitalist infuriated the Brits. During a raucous American 4th of July party one year, all the houses of Zanzibar flew American flags. One British resident, in response, hoisted a flag with the words, "No monopoly." Sayyid ordered the Brit to remove the flag, but the American party went on. After this, Hamilton went to Sayyid, steaming mad. He tried appealing to Sayyid in personal terms, trying to convince him that, quote, "the people about him who advised him to treat or allow British subjects to be treated as they were at Zanzibar were not his real friends," end quote. We don't know how that meeting ended, but soon after, Sayyid issued a public order for the customs master to gather all the gum copal in the market and reserve it. Hamilton initially thought this was a response to his meeting, in that Sayyid was trying to distribute it more equitably. Alas, as he watched an American vessel consigned to Richard Waters dock in the harbor, he realized that Sayyid's order had simply been to reserve it for the American vessel. And when Mr. Waters' ships arrive, Hamilton moaned, "All hands must wait until he is supplied." In 1844, things had become so dire for the Brits that they appealed directly to Sayyid, traders appealed directly to Sayyid, with, quote, "the greatest alarm to protest their subordinate status." Quote, "We shall not allow our most valuable connections to be destroyed by the vexations and uncalled for interference of Mr. Waters, who, availing himself of his official station, seems determined to induce your highness, if possible, to give him personally an unfair advantage over us in the market," end quote. They continued pleading for Sayyid to recognize that in their opinions, quote, "no government should allow foreign officials to prostitute their office for their individual advantage," end quote. What the Brits did not understand is that Waters was not seeking his own individual advantage, or rather, his own individual advantage was linked to the advantage of American markets. And the New England market had become inextricably linked with the East African market. By viewing the Indian Ocean almost exclusively through the lens of abolition, the Brits missed the boat, so to speak, or boats, that were flooding East Africa's shores full of American goods. To conclude, the Indian Ocean in the age of Sayyid ought to be understood or interpreted more than just a space for the ultimate concourse of British hegemony. The British were neither politically, militarily, nor commercially dominant in the first half of the 19th century. In fact, they were aware of their subordinate position. This paper has sought to add to recent literature demonstrating how and why the British Empire, quote, "foundered against the claims of other resilient empires and the evasive adaptations of clusters of small polities or fluid commercial networks," end quote. Narrating this history backwards, according to the endpoint of British Empire, misses important components of this history. The popular culture of enterprise that transformed New England in the first half of the 19th century was also taking off in East Africa. As venture capitalists, the Omani and East African merchants in Sayyid's domains were crucial players in establishing a market economy that linked the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. The local traders that Waters employed in managing New England merchant portfolios were doing, in an overlooked space in the literature on capitalism, what economists today call financial intermediation. They matched producers or holders of certain goods with people from around the world who had the capital to invest. While Richard Burton, the famous British traveler and writer, might have complained that, quote, "with bad water and even worse liquor, no Brit could ever be happy in Zanzibar," end quote, Americans, Indians, Omanis, and East Africans found the domains of the Omani Empire profitable places for cementing important components of our present-day global economic system. Thank you.
Thank you so much, to the organizers of this conference, Professor Abusharaf in particular. We've been corresponding about my work, which is on the Zanzibari community in primarily in Muscat, in modern-day Oman. I am going to ask for your help and your feedback. I am in the process of completing a book on this subject called Children of the Lost Colony, Zanzibar's Arab Exiles and the Transformation of National Citizenship in the Post-Colonial Indian Ocean. And I pretty much have the chapter breakdown, but I would like to get your feedback on where to begin the first chapter. Yeah, I've toyed with different ways of beginning the book, whether or not I should begin with the establishment of a modern Zanzibar nationality in the early 1900s under the colonial protectorate, whether or not I should begin with the so-called time of politics, when Zanzibar begins a transition to independence that happens in 1963, subsequent to the revolution of *64. But the basic structure of the book looks at the denationalization of Zanzibar's Arab community. I look at some records from the UNHCR to chart the course that some of the refugees from Zanzibar made to different Gulf states. Ironically enough, although many of them did end up in Oman, initially in 1964, most of them were not able to enter the country because the Sultan at the time either viewed them as potential subversives or was simply not interested in opening up Oman to that number of people coming, although he did accept a small number of refugees. And then I talk about a publication called the Free Zanzibar Voice, which was one of the primary exile newspapers of the community, founded by someone named Ahmed Saif Kharousi, who was initially very close to the Sultan, and settled in the south of England, in Southampton, or Portsmouth rather, and publishes basically critiques of the state in Zanzibar, of Karume, and increasingly, as time goes on, of Nyerere. And then what I'm going to talk a little bit about today in the time that I have is an excerpt from chapter 4, which charts the return migration, and you can put that in quotes because most of those who are returning had never actually set foot in Oman before they arrived. But the metaphor, if you will, or the toolbox enabling them to return was this idea of Omani descent, which becomes newly important after 1970. And maybe I'll just read a little bit to give you some framework. In Oman, oil enabled the state to escape its own history of contested sovereignty and become a modern nation state. Of course, before 1970, and actually in part because of the discovery of oil, this rivalry between two separate sovereignties in Oman, the Imamate and the Sultanate, culminates in the Sultan defeating the Imamate. By the late 1970s, Oman had entered a period of affluence which, if it did not compare to the oil booms in nearby Dubai or Abu Dhabi, was nevertheless unprecedented in its long history. Oil wealth provided the primary material horizon for new subject formations of nation, ethnicity, and class. A large part of nation building was the project of training a national bourgeois in European and American metropolitan centers to come home to the Gulf and assume roles in various ministries and state institutions. The indigenization of the labor force in these states has proceeded unevenly, haunted by the region's dependence on former colonial expatriates and low-wage South Asian labor. In Oman in 1970, all but 3 of 210 senior staff positions at Petroleum Development of Oman were filled by expatriates. And there's no question that oil wealth, combined with a low population of citizens and a robust bill of social services and goods, has helped the nationalist mythologies of the Gulf states achieve a high degree of hegemony. The major difference between Oman and other states of the Gulf is that Oman's nation-building project involved the return of a diasporic population of Omani descent numbering in the hundreds of thousands and residing in East Africa since the mid-19th century. A 1970 PDO report put Oman's in-country population as less than 500,000. At the time, 10,000 Omanis were in Kuwait, as well as many more, an unspecified number in East Africa. Of the latter, those in East Africa, a particularly prominent role has been played by a socio-economically elite class of Arab Zanzibaris, some of whom were actually members of Zanzibar's civil service before the 1964 revolution. Most were made exiles by that revolution or left in the Karume years or immediately after his 1972 assassination. One of the things that I'm looking at in this particular chapter that I'm reading is the transformation of national citizenship. This is a conga produced for Omanis. It's a Oman El Yom. This is actually from a book by Dr. Sharifa Zawawi, showing that this conga culture of East Africa also had an Omani dimension, and there were congas actually being produced in response to the return migration of those of Omani descent, Swahili-speaking Omanis or Omani Zanzibaris. And then I'll tell you a little bit about this remarkable man, Sayyid Shaksi. If you do work in the Zanzibar archives and you look at the late colonial period, Sayyid Shaksi's name will show up in a lot of different places. He was part of the Zanzibar civil service. Interestingly, when I interviewed him, he said he only first started going to school at age 11. He was initially prohibited. And he was taught by 2 future presidents of Zanzibar. Like them, he was a Makerere graduate. We were commenting this morning that, and I haven't tabulated the numbers, but you could probably look at a lot of these returnees who played key roles in the Omani state and trace them back to Makerere educations. Interestingly, he told me he was elected president of the Swahili Propagation Society at Makerere, and Benjamin Mkapa, who was future president of Tanzania, was his secretary. At Makerere itself, Mwai Kibaki was one of his teachers. And then he goes back to Zanzibar and begins working for the chief minister and later for the Ministry of Finance. He actually told me he visited the UN right before the revolution in 1963. And then it doesn't show up as well here, but what he says about the revolution was very minimal, but he said, seeing what I saw, I knew there was no future for me. Apparently, he said his wife worked at the hospital and saw those who were coming in wounded or injured. And so he goes to Lamu in Kenya, and he sails on a dhow to Oman. He's 29 years old at the time, married with 1 son. And he goes to Oman, and he first goes to Dubai, and he is serving on the Trucial Council. And there he meets the Sayyid Tariq, who appoints Sayyid in the Ministry of Finance and then later he becomes undersecretary in the health department. And what he says of the health department was that it was run by a doctor who didn't have the administrative know-how, but according to Sayyid, he said, I had good experience of setting up ministry during the transition from the British protectorate, and he really took this ministry from, he said, 35 employees and 11 doctors to a staff of about 4,000 in about 5 years. And that involves not just building the Ministry of Health, but also building housing for all of those who would work for the Ministry of Health. This is, you know, there's a lot of extras that go into building this ministry. He founds the Consul General, the Omani Consul General in Karachi, and he becomes a founding member of Bank Muscat. I think it's called Bank Al Ali initially, later becomes Bank Muscat. So just to show you that and there's a number of people like him. He's probably the most prominent example of what I'm trying to illustrate, but he is by no means unique. The person most responsible for setting up Sultan Qaboos University is in fact a Zanzibari who was involved with the Ministry of Education in Zanzibar, and you could go down the list. And then I think, how am I doing on time? I haven't seen any watch or anything. Good? Yeah, okay. Well, I think I will leave it there. I was going to read a poem, but maybe we can get to that in discussion. But I just wanted to give you a brief illustration or a snapshot of the larger book, and hope we can continue the conversation. Thank you.
And so I wanted to look at the extent to which and the ways in which Omani Ibadism has had or has not had similar transnational linkages. And I think that really when it comes to Islamic studies, the study of Ibadism is very much it's kind of marginalized. And so I think it's important to bring it to the fore a bit more. And so when it comes to the practice of Ibadism in Oman in particular, Dale Eichelman, I think, identifies two paradoxes that I think kind of help inform our understanding of how it's practiced there and how the imamate worked. The first is related to the notion that an imamate, of course, is meant to include the entire ummah, the entire community of Muslims, when in fact, when the Ibadi imamate did exist between 720 and 1719, and then between 1869 and 1954, it only really ever enjoyed a fairly narrow ethnic, tribal, and territorial following. The second is that, of course, although notables and educated people are meant to select leaders based on their capabilities within the imamate, which is related to Ibadi's self-description as Ahl al-Shura, or people of consultation. In reality, the selection of leadership was based nearly the exclusive province of an oligarchic tribal elite. Despite these paradoxes, though, Ibadism remains very much a part of, I'd argue, Omani identity and politics, although it's not completely bureaucratized in the way that we see religion and politics bureaucratized in Saudi Arabia, for instance, with the Wahhabi ulama very much entangled with the Al Saud ruling family since 1744, essentially. So J. Peterson talks about Oman's historic geographic isolation from the centers of Islamic empire as having made it a welcome environment for Ibadism to flourish. So in his estimation, it was what he dubbed the unifying force of Islam that led to Arab political control over Oman, and that the Ibadi ideal kind of provided important support for leaders in Oman to help sedentarize tribal populations, particularly in the interior. On top of that, Jones and Ragout have hypothesized that the adoption of Islam was connected to a flurry of diplomatic activity, in particular with Saudi Arabia and other centers of Sunni Islam, and kind of centers of Sunni Muslim soft power. And so it was kind of also something of a strategic move in terms of the adoption of Ibadism. Today, of course, Oman houses the world's largest Ibadi community, which is estimated to be between 55 to 60% of the total Omani population, with other of the major Ibadi communities in the Algerian Mazhab, Libya, and East Africa. And of course, the Omani Ibadi imamate's relationship with East Africa, particularly with Zanzibar, has by far been the strongest. And looking at the contributions of Muslim scholars in Zanzibar to Ibadism in general also, I think, challenges the Arab-centric study of Islam that dominates Islamic studies today, and also is kind of an interesting point of departure as to how religion fits into how we think about Indian Ocean circularities. When it comes to Omani domestic politics, Ibadism has helped in the co-optation of central tribal figures and who basically were empowered to control their small kind of fiefdoms, so that the government managed to keep control rather inexpensively and efficiently in the 19th century. And of course, this allowed for Sayyidi leadership to then look abroad for opportunities and ultimately become the primary maritime power of the Indian Ocean between the mid-17th and mid-20th centuries. So when it comes to East Africa in particular, of course, Omanis have settled there for centuries, with Zanzibar in particular falling under Omani control from the mid-17th to the mid-19th centuries, and becoming a major focus of the policies of Sayyid ibn Sultan, who ruled between 1806 and 1856, whom we heard about earlier. And meanwhile, other areas of East Africa did have a lot of Omani influence there, and often were dominated by individual Omani families, but much more in an unofficial capacity. Their primary goal was not to have political control, but rather to maintain economic inroads. So when Sayyid consolidated control over the Swahili coast, he moved the capital of Oman to Zanzibar in 1832. There we have an Ibadi minority essentially ruling over a majority Sunni Shafi population. And in the 19th century, Zanzibar became a very important center for Islamic scholarship, particularly attracting people from other parts of East Africa, from Oman and from Yemen. And this spurred some Shafi influence in Ibadi writings, and the cosmopolitanism of Zanzibar's religious community during this time in the 19th century has spurred Amal Ghazal's comparison of it to Andalusia. So in the first half of the 19th century, many leading Omani Ibadi scholars emigrated to Zanzibar, and religious scholars formed an integral part of Sayyid's court, with some working as judges, advisors, imams, envoys, and teachers, and they were involved in the government of Zanzibar, at least to some extent, according to what I've read, due to their religious tolerance of both non-Ibadis and of non-Muslims. And I think the incorporation of these thinkers and scholars allowed for the development of an educated and literate state bureaucracy, which is exactly what Oman needed in order to expand its presence abroad. Still, it should be emphasized that despite the fact that a lot of religious figures did come from Oman to Zanzibar, this was not really a missionary project. This was not the Ikhwan of Saudi Arabia essentially trying to change people's religious outlooks. This was much more about expanding for mercantile purposes. So toward the end of the 19th and into the early 20th century, Ibadis and Shafis began consulting with one another. And Valerie Hoffman has written about how Ibadi scholars from Oman, with their greater command of Arabic language, often studied with Shafi students, many of whom were Swahilis, and deferred to Omanis who had kind of a native command of Arabic. And in turn, some Ibadi students then learned from these Shafi students, and so you have a really nice kind of knowledge exchange and a cosmopolitan Zanzibari religious environment, really, that was a center of scholarly activity. During this period, several Islamic institutions were established through the presence of the ulama and religious judges from Oman, who aided in the propagation of what Amal Ghazal dubs, and I quote, a literate Islamic tradition that was Arabic in character. They also brought ideas and ideologies, ties and connections, and along with the rulers, they changed the intellectual and political landscape of Zanzibar. Together, they pulled Zanzibar closer to the Arab and Muslim world, end of quote. And I think this is interesting because it seems like Ghazal is kind of conflating Arabic in character with really kind of Sunni Islam as practiced in places like Egypt or Saudi Arabia, rather than kind of connecting to the broader world. So it begs the question of what exactly is Arabic in character? How has this affected Omani development and also Zanzibar's development as well? So essentially, Oman provided kind of spiritual and religious guidance in Zanzibar, while in turn, this engagement with Zanzibar kind of brought Oman into global discourses on modernity at the turn of the 20th century in particular, and especially as related to Islam. Despite this interaction, though, as I mentioned before, there wasn't an attempt to convert locals. The main concern was maintaining stability for commercial routes, which they did rather successfully until Sayyid's death in 1856, when a rivalry emerged among his sons, which is a long story that I'm sure all of you could tell me about in much better detail. But essentially, this led to the Canning Award, overseen by the British, dividing Muscat from Zanzibar in 1861 and paving the way for a much larger British presence both in Muscat and in Zanzibar, a move which the British governor of Bombay dubbed as having spurred, quote, the ruin of a flourishing country and kingdom, end quote. So I guess just to skip ahead massively, I mean, through the kind of decline of Omani maritime power, and as its economy lagged, and then you have kind of the discovery of oil, British power coming into the Arabian Peninsula and kind of retreating, we see the rise of Sultan Qaboos in 1970, and really I would argue that this was kind of the start of a focus on nation building in Oman. And really centralization of political power. And to that end, I think he also stressed kind of the Arab and Muslim character of the country, but without explicit reference to Ibadism, perhaps because it is seen as not necessarily Arab or Sunni enough to kind of make Oman part of the broader Middle East as we often think about it, as correct or incorrect as that may be. The government also sought to promote what Mark Valery has described as a consensual and generic Islam, which kind of glosses over a lot of more problematic issues of the past. And as Frank Mermier, I think, has described Ibadi heritage in Oman, he says it is, and I quote, both covered up and glorified, end quote. Indeed, even Oman's shift from theocracy to monarchy in the 1950s, it should be noted, did not happen abruptly, nor did it change the patterns of domestic power drastically. Rather, sultans of Oman, as Eichelman points out, managed to make the first steps to unify Oman, not by kind of smashing the imamate, but rather by insistently drawing on the same source of popular legitimacy as the imamate, which was the rule of Islamic law, and largely using the same personnel. So rather than scrapping the imamate completely, the Sultanate did build upon it and integrated important figures into the new order. And all of this, I think, was critical to, as I mentioned, integrating all of the kind of peripheral populations into a new Omani state. So given that Ibadism is important domestically and has historically fostered relationships across borders, where do we stand today in terms of how Ibadism influences or doesn't influence Omani foreign policy? So Jones and Ragout endeavored to link Islam, in particular Ibadism, to the formation of what they dub a culture of Omani diplomacy. They posit that the most important contribution to Omani political culture of Ibadism is, in their words, and I quote, an abstention from the politics of sectarianism. The role of Ibadism in Omani diplomacy, therefore, may almost be conceptualized in terms of its absence from the scene. If Ibadism plays a role, it is by insisting that it should not play a role. End quote. And this allows Oman, I think, to pursue a foreign policy that I think is always considered a little bit different from the rest of the GCC states. It manages to maintain ties across the Gulf rift that's ongoing now, as well as with Iran. It was the first GCC state to have accepted an official visit from the Israeli Prime Minister. And I think we've seen more and more of a reorientation towards GCC neighbors, I think largely due to kind of what economic opportunities and trade links exist there. In terms of official ties with East Africa, which is not to mention at all kind of personal ties, cultural ties, or anything of that nature, I think because the economic opportunities are not in there kind of as they were in the past, we see less Omani, at least official presence as in foreign policy as maybe we would have expected. When I was reading about kind of what relationships do exist, what was cited as kind of Omani support for Zanzibar was kind of the introduction of direct flights from Muscat to Zanzibar in the 90s, as well as its aiding in Zanzibar's application for the membership to the Islamic Conference Organization. So not exactly kind of huge steps. But I think that really what has happened is we see a domesticization, basically an internalization of kind of the same characteristics that aided Omani multilateral foreign policy have really aided it more on the domestic stage. So in particular, efforts to dilute differences between Ibadi and Sunni schools of Islam and general anti-sectarianism have been important in Oman. Notably, however, Ibadism is still very much the state religion. It's the only state in the GCC other than Saudi that has a Grand Mufti, both of whom have been Ibadi, as have ministers of justice, along with most leading figures and most of the powerful imams in these departments, demonstrating the prevailing supremacy of Ibadism even in state apparatuses. This is not to say, however, that Sultan Qaboos really relied upon Islam in building legitimacy. I mean, he did use references to Ibadism and did kind of demonstrate that he was a good Muslim, publicly, but he didn't successfully, kind of integrate religion in the same way as we see in the Saudi case in particular. We do see the creation of parallel yet subordinate state bureaucratic structures housing important religious figures today. Sultan Qaboos also, as Mark Valerie described, endeavored to make Ibadism kind of the national Islam, and this is something that could be seen as particularly important because, as Nate mentioned, there was this uneven integration of diasporic populations into Oman. But I think today, despite historical links, connections between Oman and Ibadi communities of Tanzania, Algeria, and Tunisia have weakened since Sultan Qaboos came to power in 1970 and focused primarily on state building. Further, the integration of key Ibadi religious figures allows the regime to manage their influence and harness it. So Ibadism, although once linked Oman to the very cosmopolitan scholarly center of Zanzibar, I would argue that today it's been deliberately nationalized as a domestic instrument rather than being used for a potential diplomatic advantage. So concerns of state building, I guess, would have replaced desires to build cross-regional religious communities. Indeed, religious cross-border connectivity due to concerns about, for instance, the transnational Muslim Brotherhood or violent international jihadist movements has been maligned in the recent era. So we see an interesting instance here, I'd argue, of a decreasing Indian Ocean connectivity over time, largely due to kind of lack of economic opportunity. I think whether and how this could change, as well as how this shift is explained in domestic literature in Oman, are worth interrogating. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Well, I think we are in time. We have about 15 minutes for discussion. If I can abuse my power as chairman, to start as a Zanzibari, that's my excuse. Just to start the discussion, I agree with Nicholas Roberts' analysis, except one thing is that the Americans, from the beginning really to the end, were interested, the consulate, were interested only in trade. You read all the correspondence and you don't really find really too many remarks about politics. They really did not want to be involved. And almost all the consuls were traders. So that is important on the one side. They never had political interest in Zanzibar at that time. But the British, when they came, they always had a dual interest. In fact, it was when they came, Hamilton was supposed to be sent to Muscat as consul. And then because Sayyid moved to Zanzibar, he followed him there. So East Africa, as far as the British were concerned, was not of interest. Trade was being conducted by their British Indian subjects, and they were quite happy with that. So him coming there, it was entirely political interest. And as far as the British were concerned, Zanzibar's importance was because it was ruled by the same sultan as Oman. Oman was important for them politically. Control of the Red Sea, of the Persian Gulf, that was what was important. This is why all the consuls were political throughout. And so I think you are absolutely right in terms of economic interests. Really, they never had a say really until much, much later. Until, in fact, the Civil War. This is when American strength was broken. And then the others, the Germans and the French, came in. So that was sort of my comment just to start the discussion. And I'm talking now a discussion. Now I'm going back to my role. Anybody else?
Hi, thank you all. Terrific papers. I have a question for Nick and for Courtney, and I'll have a suggestion for Nate. For Nick, I was wondering if I could just get you to articulate one of the arguments that you started the paper with. So how does the story do that work of recentering the Omanis in the narrative of the Indian Ocean and to the history of global capitalism more generally? I get that the Americans were able to sort of keep the British at bay when it came to commerce, but then is the history of global capitalism just one of Euro-American rivalry? And so then what are the Omanis doing? which they're not just Omanis at all, as you know well. So if you could talk about that a bit. For Courtney, maybe I misunderstood an earlier point, and this is not critical to the point that you're making at all in the paper, but were you suggesting that the Ibadis had no political aspirations in the interior of East Africa?
I guess my main point was that it wasn't a religious conversion kind of project. So political aspirations and economic aspirations. I mean, kind of mercantile interests were number one, and then kind of below that, of course, there were political interests, especially for Sayyid, who's super interested in Zanzibar, obviously having moved the capital there. But oh, sorry. The interior. I don't. Yeah, I'm not sure, to be honest. But I guess the point I was trying to make is that this wasn't essentially kind of like a Saudi exercise of trying to export religion. So it was more about economic.
Are we going to do a collection or one-on-one?
Yeah, well, we can answer.
Okay. Thank you, Fahd. I'm glad you asked that. So two things I was struggling with as I wrote the paper and that I'm struggling in revisions is one, I didn't want it to sound like I'm just replacing one, let's say, white guy or white empire with another one, meaning who cares about the Brits, let's talk about the Americans. And I also didn't want it to sound like it's sort of a triumphalist, make America great again, American empire type thing. But I think in the context of the rest of the project, if everything else is going to be centering the Omani Empire and capitalism, we have to have at least one discussion of turning the volume down on the Brits. And one of the things I'm going to do more in that chapter is even just simple word choices, like who's doing what. Like instead of saying Hammerton went to Sayyid, Sayyid received Hammerton. Which I need to revise those things. But for the project as a whole, I mean, I want this to be a global microhistory of Sayyid, but he left behind no writings. The only writings of his that we do have are letters to the Americans, the Brits, and the French. And so that is something I'm really struggling with, is how do we, and it's a big debate of the historian's craft, right? I mean, historians of gender and women and stuff struggle with these things too, is how do we tell the story of people whose writings and voices are not explicitly in the archive, right?
Even in the papers that you had kindly sent me, Nick had done terrific work in the Peabody Essex Museum and sent me copies of way more than he needed to. There's Arabic documentation, there are contracts and things like that in there. So how do you fit that into that? I mean, I think it works beautifully actually for the story that you're trying to tell.
Yeah.
But I want you to be able to.
No, I think that's a great point. That is something that I'll have to work more on. I mean, rather than rather than just mentioning Omani entrepreneurs and stuff, actually dive into their own papers. Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, if you're going to recenter the Omanis in this narrative of global capitalism, then do that, right?
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to necessarily be Sayyid in this part. I didn't want to monopolize this discussion. I'm sorry.
No, it's true. Thank you. Fahad's on my committee, so I'll hear more of that anyway.
Well, thank you for three very interesting papers. And actually, I just want to pick up on this point because certainly one of the things that Oman, Zanzibar, and Zanzibar would continue doing for decades and decades after the peak of American influence would be sending their own vessels around the world, establishing steamship service between Zanzibar and Bombay. But of course, one of the key players in this, and this brings me to my question, is Ahmed bin Haman, who's the representative of Zanzibar and La Réunion in China and ultimately in the US, most famously. And in that case, it's fascinating that there's so much material from the British perspective about the so-called American faction in Zanzibar. So I'm talking about internal politics now at the Zanzibari court. And Hammerton himself talks in great detail about the influence that they had and that all the letters, all Sayyid's correspondence were through the American faction and they would approve or I mean, there's a lot of detail. So my question is really what you've been able to discover about that group, about the influence within the Sultan's court of those who are more American-oriented in their commercial or diplomatic interests. I just wonder if there's a lot more material there that we could learn about internal politics of Oman Zanzibar. But actually, I want to ask Nate a question about your really fascinating presentation and forthcoming book. And that's about these broader links between Zanzibaris in exile and Jamshid specifically, because of course, I mean, we mentioned Jamshid a couple times already yesterday and today, and he's not in Oman, obviously, and he's still alive. I just wonder, and this is a question from a position of ignorance on my part, what position does he hold in the imagination of Zanzibaris in Oman and elsewhere? But also it seems like the connections between him and the Zanzibari community are in exile are in some cases strong, in some cases not. So I just want to get your perspective on how people think about him, both now as well as in the years immediately after the revolution.
Shall I answer that? Thank you for that question. Sayyid Jamshid, the last Sultan of Zanzibar, some people say that if Sultan Khalifa bin Harub, who passed away basically a year or so before the revolution, if he had still been Sultan, the revolution might not have happened. Jamshid had a reputation as somebody who was more partisan towards one political party in Zanzibar, the Zanzibar Nationalist Party. He goes into exile, and you see in the exile newspapers that I've read that there is an awareness by those in exile that there is an underground democratic movement in Zanzibar, and that bringing back the Sultan is not really a going concern for them. And so they switch the rhetoric or they transition it towards, well, we just want a popular referendum. And so what Jamshid repeatedly says when he's interviewed is that if my subjects ask me to go back, I will go back. I don't know when that idea is, like, it kind of fades. What I do know is that Salman Amur pardons Sayyid Jamshid. Salman Amur was president of Zanzibar, and pardons him and says that he is welcome to come back as a private citizen to Zanzibar. Again, I'm not sure if he ever does, although some of his kids may have. But he never comes to Oman. And that has to do with the politics of lineage around the Sayyid line. Sultan Qaboos is a direct lineal descendant of Sayyid Saʿīd, as is Sayyid Jamshid. And so it presents, or at least this is how it was explained to me when I asked people in Muscat, the Zanzibar community, about it. Jamshid can't come back to Oman because it would introduce this issue of succession. So yeah, that's what I know.
Just a quick answer, even though it deserves a long answer to your question, Professor Pressold, is I can answer it actually by putting it in conversation with Fahed's question. One of the things we learn about the American faction, as you say, in Zanzibar throughout East Africa from the British correspondence is, well, one of the reasons why the Brits couldn't really keep up with them is that the Americans they bought into the whole Waraka system of East Africa. So at these papers that, in the archives throughout the Northeast, you see the American traders writing the same style of, the Arabic debt contracts that Fahed has written about as any East African trader would have. I mean, so they totally bought into this system of trade because it was so lucrative and profitable as entrepreneurs. So I think that's one thing we learn about the American faction, because the British, they talk about this. You know, they can't keep up with what the Americans are doing. So.
I know you're not looking at the 18th century, the late 18th century, but I don't know, this comment or rather accusation coming from Governor Durate, the Portuguese governor, would help in what Sheriff was trying to say. It were the English who permitted them, the Muscatee, a free port in Bombay. It was the English who introduced them to Surat and where they could build their ships. So, I mean, the entire argument is going on around that how the British were, the Muscatees and the British connections were operating in connivance with each other and trying to bypass the authorities in the East Africa. So how do you see that? Because you are talking about Anglo-American rivalry in the political backdrop. We have economic activities also, right? And they had also started around the same time.
I mean, so there's no question, you know, the British, they did have some hegemony and dominance
Yes.
in the Indian Ocean. But that being said, I mean, the ports of India are long ways away from the ports of East Africa. And that kind of sovereignty that they had in India didn't necessarily translate into the kind of sovereignty they had in East Africa. I mean, Sayyid over and over again openly flouted the British. You know, the British would say, we want you to do this, and he just wouldn't do it. But I think the really important thing is digging deeper into this nature of British, like what exactly did the British Empire mean, British sovereignty mean in the Indian Ocean? You know, there's been a lot of work on how historians have shown how these local actors used British Empire against them in a way. I mean, they used British trade routes for their own personal profit and gain. I mean, that's Niall Green and James Galvin, and British Empire doesn't necessarily mean that everyone else stops doing what they had been doing. You know.
So my question is kind of thinking about the U.S. investment in East Africa is purely economic and not political. So I'm kind of thinking of U.S. imperialism in the 19th century, both through the discourse of manifest destiny and the particular settler colonial aspects of it. And I guess I just want to ask, because chattel slavery is still legal in the U.S. in the period that you're working on, what are the stakes of positioning U.S. venture capital, which relies on so many logics of insurance and speculation and finance? What's at stake at framing that as purely economic and not political? And so I wonder if you could speak to that. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, certainly everything is political. There's politics in everything. I mean, I'm not in the paper, I'm not trying to frame it as this was just economic, but just to say that these people, they did approach it as entrepreneurs, whether it was political entrepreneurs or economic entrepreneurs. But I wonder too, I mean, I don't know, I wonder if one of the other reasons why, the Americans didn't go to East Africa and talk about abolition with the Omanis, because they were coming from a slaveholding society themselves. So I wonder if that's also a degree of why there was such equanimity between them.
But if I might say, Roberts, Waters, the first consul, who is constantly preaching to Sayyid, and that you are terrible, you are employing slaves and all that kind of thing, at a time when the Americans had begun to use southern cotton to make Merikani to transport to Zanzibar. And so there is some hypocrisy there. But, oh yes, please.
Could I also just ask a question, just make a quick comment. I have a comment for Nate and also for Nicholas. For Nicholas, there was a moment in your paper where I think you said the British, through seeing Zanzibar through the lens of abolition, missed the vote. And I think there might be a problem with that argument given the timing. So the Royal Navy, to the best of my knowledge, does not capture a single slave ship in the Indian Ocean between 1828 and 1839. And the one in 1839 is actually shipwrecked and is sort of rescued. And it really isn't until January of 1840 that there are any captures. There's about an 11-year period when there's essentially no active captures of slave ships. So the timing's a bit off, and Hamilton is not particularly strong in his abolitionism. He's essentially turning a blind eye to slavery every day. He makes very little headway, as I think, as you know, with the Sultan. So the idea that abolitionism is the primary focus, I think, given the timing, might be problematic, might be something to talk more about. And then for Nate, in answer to your question about where to start, my thought was go back to 1800 in your first chapter, but to do it sort of like Glassman does, and just do it in 4 pages, rather than get into a really lengthy, but I think your readers will need some context for the 19th century to make sense of the 20th.
Yeah, I think it's your call. So I'm so happy to be here. Thank you so much, Georgetown University. I love you. So let me start because I don't have so much time. So these are the photos which I took several places in the East African coast, and then you can find out Kanga, which I'm going to talk today. And then if I explain what is Kanga, I mean, it takes so long time. So I have several Kanga samples, so please have a look. And actually, this one, Professor Opers gave me several years ago, and this is the general Kanga made in Japan, which I'm going to talk today. So please. And then these are the photos showing the shop where Kanga is sold. You can get a pair of Kanga for $3 or $4 US. For some it's cheap, for others not cheap. So obviously not all the people can buy a brand new Kanga so often, but like in a place like Mombasa, for example, there is a second and a third hand market where you can get Kanga more affordable price. So usually every woman along the, owns plural Kangas. So Kanga is not luxury clothes, but it's more like a daily clothes regardless whether rich or poor. Therefore, women wearing Kanga is a common feature in the daily life in the East African coast. So you can see Kanga today in a town, in village, on a street, at shop, at port, and in the house. So it is safe to say Kanga is or the representative of female clothes in the Swahili society. And the researchers agree that we can trace back the origin of Kanga into the late 19th century. We have 2 possible origins. One is that ex-slaves females dyed their Americani clothes. Americani is unbleached cotton originally imported from the States, and it was recognized as a clothes for slaves. And the ex-slaves dyed and drew by themselves and wore. That is one of the possible origins. And the other is that female in a coastal town bought what is called leso, square clothes a bit larger than the handkerchief, and patched together and wore. And then this is kind of like the photo of the leso. You can find out this is a part, and then, so they stick together and making one clothes. And so this is another possibility. And then in both cases, anyway, the Kanga originated in the late 19th century, and it represented new social status, especially for ex-slave women, and then also represented some urban identity. But my question is the gap between its origin and such popularity today. In the first case, the dyeing or the drawing option, there's no reasonable explanation why and how ex-slaves' costume had been accepted by free people. If you look at the early 20th century Swahili literature, which called Desturi of Swahili, it's the customs of Swahili people. The sources of this literature came from the native free elderly males of Bagamoyo, one of the coastal towns, and we can find a strong sense of division between free and slaves, especially in a visual aspect.
Masters and free people were very keen to differentiate themselves from slaves visually. For example, like they didn't allow slaves to put sandals, and female slaves were not allowed to cover their head. And this is from the album of the French commercial mission in the 1840s. You can find out clearly who is master and who are the slaves. Sorry. In such restrictions, I suppose that ex-slaves had a strong aspiration to reclothe themselves when they got to be free. If so, I guess that the free status female could not so easily accept clothes which were invented by slaves. And as to the second possibility, lasso, that is not cheap. Indeed, patching lasso by themselves, that was a cheaper option than any other clothing option, but still I find a gap to get such a popularity as today. Because patching is a time-consuming work, so we cannot expect large quantity, and then also quality would be different one after another. I mean, this is the same to the dyeing and the drawing option. Of course, we know the development of kanga, the history of the development of kanga, like by the 1890s, local manufacturers started to make a block printing on Americani. And there are also mentions of kanga import to Zanzibar in the British Trade Report in the 1890s. But we cannot overestimate with these evidence. For example, Laura Fair admits that at the turn of the century, kanga remained as some urban fashion, and then countryside women wore kaniki, indigo-dyed clothes. I mean, these are photos seem to have been taken at the turn of the century. You can find the vivid contrast. So the kanga and the kaniki and an urban and the countryside. So I suppose in order to overcome the gap which I concern, we need to look at the stage of the industrialization. Industrialization here indicates both mass production and a subsequent reduction of price, and then also standardization. And if industrialization is a key to understand, we need to include Japanese kanga in our site. The kanga made in Japan emerged sometimes in the end of 1920s and occupied the market after the Second World War until 1970s. During this period, what I call industrialization took place. So, and with this case study, what I like to address is the issue of the framework. The conventional framework for the Japanese kanga export to East Africa is so-called Japan-Africa relations. Personally, I'm not in favor of this framework in general, I mean not only kanga, because it seems that we easily ignore so-called middle passages with this framework. So at the very early stage of my research on this topic, I found the framework of the Indian Ocean world is more appropriate because I found out various clues to place this case study in the Indian Ocean framework, some of which I will introduce later. And the Indian Ocean world here indicate the map like this. So various small networks connect each other and create larger network world of the Indian Ocean emerges. So the story of Japanese kanga connect its east end with the west end. It sounds quite nice. So I wrote one book chapter along this line. But recently I'm wondering if the Indian Ocean world is really the framework, enough framework to capture the unity of the entity of the story of the Japanese kanga. So the rest of the time I will trace the development of Japanese kanga while considering the framework. So Japanese start to contact East Africa since the mid-20s, 1920. Osaka Shosen Kaisha, which Dr. Preshold introduced yesterday, opened the East African regular route in 1926. And this is the ship which engaged in the earlier voyage of the regular route to the East Africa, which is called Canada Mother. So Canada coming from Canada. So I don't know why the ship's name's Canada going to the East Africa, but anyway, this is the first ship. And then 4 years later, Osaka Prefectural Institute of Trade hosted exposition featuring Africa. This growing interest of East Africa was emerged under the circumstance of Japan's international isolation. And this, I mean, lots of things happened around at the turn of the 30s, and then even before as well. And this led exclusion of Japanese products from the existing market. And then the Japanese main industry at the time was the textile industry. And if you look at the statistics, this is the total textile export in 1930 and 31. You can find out a sharp drop in China, and the second major market, British India, also dropped. Like that, most of the place, the monetary volume dropped, but other African countries, in which I mean, East Africa included, I'm here, you can find out, I mean, so other African countries, one of the very few exceptions which increased. So East Africa was definitely the promising market for the Japanese manufacturer and exporter, which had not yet explored. Because firstly, it's prominent because of their strong local purchasing power. And this is from a newspaper article in the 1830s. The strong local purchasing power were repeatedly mentioned in the newspaper and in journal and an official report at the time. And then secondly, there was Congo-Beijing treaties which guaranteed free trade to any nationals. This is why isolating Japan has a chance to enter the market in East Africa. And then exporters and manufacturers were so eager to enter the market. And then this is a consular report from Mombasa reporting that, the consulate sent sample of local textile following the request from the Textile Export Association in Osaka. So they studied the more favorable material in the local market in the East Africa. So therefore, this is based on the statistics of the East African cotton import after the regular route opened in 1926. We can find out steady increase of the Japanese share. So the bottom red is the Japanese share. So you can find out steady increase. And then this is a breakdown according to the items of the Japanese Japanese export to the East African market. So you can find out Japanese product enter the market, first cheaper materials such as like unbleached cotton, and then much expensive item follows. I mean, this is a very typical pattern for the newcomers entering the market. But actually, Japanese products had entered already into the market before the regular route opened. This I draw from a published report from the first commercial mission sent when the regular route opened. So the author found out Japanese products were already there when they arrived. And if we look at the contemporary document carefully, already in the 1923 and 24, Japanese cotton textile accounting for over 30% of total cotton textile import in the British East Africa. I suppose these were flown into Aden or Bombay, where Japanese companies settled their branches, or via Southeast Asia, which I will mention later. And then this indirect flow of Japanese textile continued until the end of the World War II. And then the question is, where is Kanga? And this is part of the monthly report of the Mombasa Consulate in 1933. And in this part, it said, in this month, I found the import of Kanga from Japan for the first time. And then actually, going back to the statistics, from 1934, we can find out Kanga in the statistics, and then Japanese Kanga occupied some 20% share toward the end of the 30s. As to the background of the increase of the share, we can find out some technological innovations. Sumitomo Shindo Kokan and manufactured copper roller, and then Nihon Seifu invented suitable cotton fabric for printing. Both were the leading company for each field at the time. So if you, especially the copper roller, you should have some 160 centimeter circumference. So it was quite huge. And if you, I mean, this Japanese lady always not so tall, but you can find out how gigantic of the roller is. And then, but I assume that Japanese Kanga entered into East African market much earlier, according to my interview and some other sources like private memos. My informants were those who worked at the Nishizawa company, which is the same as Nishihachi, yesterday Professor Presshold mentioned. Nishizawa is a company located in Osaka specializing in African trade, and it still exists. And it was once the leading exporter of Kanga. And since Nishizawa does not have an old record, I'm not sure, but they said so. So interview and a private memoir are clue to discover earlier history of the company. And according to the short memoir of the founder of Nishizawa cited in the local newspaper in 1960, the first Kanga export going back to the 1928. And what is very interesting to me is not the date, but I mean that it was Indian merchant who ordered Kanga. That was the beginning of Nishizawa's Kanga export. The term Indian merchant is always tricky, and there's no solid evidence who he was. But the larger Indian community was there in Kobe at the time, and there was Bora community, Bora merchants, who engaged in a textile export business. And then, of course, extensive Bora network already exists in East Africa at the time, and many engaged in retail business. I don't have further sources to connect Kobe Bora and East African Bora, which I'm trying, but I suspect one of these Kobe Bora ordered the first Kanga. And another orders came from Southeast Asia. I mean, Dutch company in Batavia and a British company in Bangkok ordered Kanga. And then they transshipped to East Africa once they received at Batavia and Bangkok. So the memoir admit that in the early stage, Nishizawa didn't know the destination of their Kanga. And most probably, manufacturers as well, they didn't recognize what they manufactured was Kanga. In other words, connection between the east end and the west end of the Indian Ocean was available only through existing commercial network, while Japanese manufacturers didn't know who the customer of their products were. And this continued until even after the Japan-East African regular route opened. This is because of lack of money transfer facility. And especially as to the Dutch connection, we can find out in the manufacturing sector, both private memo and interview shows that Nishizawa used the Kanga of Fritz Sengen and a company, that is a leading Dutch company, as a model. So they imitated. But what is interesting is that one of the recent studies, not me, discovered some samples from Bombay in Fritz Sengen archives. So that means also Dutch company imitated the textile from Bombay. So you can find out kind of like a imitation flow of network from Bombay to Bombay to Dutch to Japan. And then these actors were behind of the steady increase of Japanese Kanga share in the market. But since the beginning of 1940, due to the war, I mean, they couldn't produce Kanga any longer, and then only they can survive after 1945. And then actually the peak of the Japanese Kanga export came in the mid 50s to 70s. And in 58, 10 Kanga printing machines worked in Japan, and some of the factory produced 4 million meter per month. It means 1.3 million pairs per month. And then now Nishizawa could trade directly with the local retailers, and this is a process which to produce Kanga. First, Nishizawa took order from local retailers. Either they carried the sample, or Kadruddin Haji Ishaq, that is a local big retailer in Mombasa, they make a rough sketch. And then that is my recent discovery from my Mombasa research. I mean, still Kadruddin Haji Ishaq keeps the sample from Nishizawa. You can find like this. And then there's some description on these samples. Otherwise, they make a rough sketch like this. And then later on, the Smith Mackenzie's Gowan Clark make an English translation of the name of the Kanga. And then Smith Mackenzie was the leading importer of the Kanga in British East Africa, but later on they lost the share because of the Japanese products. And then after that, they became a clearance agent. I mean, then during the colonial time and then even after the independence, they have to be involved in any transaction, the import. So you can find out some kind of like a growth of the colonialism even after the independence. And the Japanese designer draw counter sketches, and then now we can find like that. And then you can finally, it's reach it to the branches. So I just make quick conclusion. So global circumstances which formed a different layer from the Indian Ocean world affect so much the story of the Kanga. I mean, this layer, maybe we can call it, like following the Wallerstein way, world politics. I mean, for example, like a Japanese isolation, Congo Basin Treaty, that makes some kind of preposition of the Japanese Kanga. And then, but we still exist, but the flow of Kanga is on the existing network of the Indian Ocean. So both layers of the interact each other. I mean, the world politics and then the existing network. And of course, they interact each other. And then we can locate the Kanga made in Japan in between this layer. That is my conclusion. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure to be back here, and especially in a conference, particularly looking at the Indian Ocean with a lot of people specializing, whose work I have been, find always very inspiring. So today, my talk is about the matrilineal communities in the Indian Ocean world, and I don't think it needs an explanation why, what is matrilineal and so forth. But basically, one thing that is very important and very significant about this matrilineal community is located in the different parts of Indian Ocean, rarely studied together. So you find a lot of whether it's in the East Africa or South Asia or Southeast Asia, these different dots, you can say islands of matrilineal communities, whether in the actual islands or in the coastal regions. And they are very rarely studied together. So therefore, my interest in this topic comes from my previous research or my doctoral dissertation, which was on the Islamic law outside the Middle East. Whenever we talk about Islamic law, often the tendency is to look at Middle East alone. So what I had tried in my doctoral dissertation was to look at the Indian Ocean, as a space where, the largest Muslim communities, such as whether in Southeast Asia or in South Asia, have been, historically, at the center of the experience or the history of Islam. But, in the literature, it's often, once it comes to Islamic law particularly, it's always about, Middle East, pre-modern Middle East, so forth. So that's how I come to the topic. And then within that, there is a huge, debate or a larger thrust is on the patriarchal conceptualizations of Sharia, where whenever, it's not only the Middle Eastern, practices of it, but also the European ideas of, family and so forth, always spilled over to the ways in which the Muslim communities, particularly the matrilineal Muslim communities, were understood. And therefore, within that tradition, whether it's anthropology, Islamic studies, regional studies, law, and so forth, one thing that stood out, particularly in the early 20th century onward, when the Dutch historiography sort of, Dutch legal historiography sort of, came into the fore with what they call on the discovery of adat law, or discovery of customary law, that often stood contradictory to the Sharia or contradictory to the religion. And this conceptualization or this understanding in the discovery of adat law sort of informed many legal studies as well as historical studies. And matrilineal or matriarchy or matrifocality, whatever you call it, stood as the classical example of how the local customs contradict with the text of Quran. For example, in the cases like according to the just to give one brief example, is when in the most of these matrilineal communities, women own the entire property, and then only women. So in the Quran, according to the Quran, women get only half of what men get, right? Whereas in this context, not only that men get double, they don't get even half, or they don't get nothing, or they get nothing. So this kind of directly contact. So often matrilineal was posed as the classical example of the customary law being contradictory to the Sharia. So that is, whereas the communities themselves have historically been arguing that and interpreting that whatever they do is based on the religion. So this dichotomy is something that is also something. And then another aspect is a lot of anthropologists have studied. The historians, I come from history background. In history, rarely historians have studied the history of matrilineal before 19th century. And in anthropology, there are a lot of literature on anthropology, through ethnography, but the larger problem is that they all are single-sited ethnographies or looking at one places. Whereas once we look at like, the larger Indian Ocean context, you have these communities, this is an old map where, I was just starting with this project. You can still find a few places where the matrilineal communities are located from, the places like, I don't know whether the pointer doesn't work, I think. But, from Indonesia, Malaysia, then coming to Sri Lanka, different parts of India, and, the islands off the coast of India, and then in Southeast Africa as well as East Africa. And there are some more communities which eventually I discovered through my research. So in this context, in this particular paper, what I'm looking at is, how does mobility particularly affect matrilineal systems? And what is the role of Islam and its laws in legitimizing or delegitimizing the mobile kin members and their immobile properties? Because one thing that is common in all these places, like, as you can see in the previous map, is that, like, what unifies these communities is of course, the Indian Ocean, right? All these communities are located around the Indian Ocean. And the second aspect is that, they're all Islamic, they are Muslim communities. I'm not saying that there are not non-Muslim communities such as the Nayars or the Hindu Nayar community in Kerala, Southwest India, as well as several Christian and even Jewish communities, historically speaking. But Islam is sort of a unifying factor between these communities as well as the Indian Ocean. So, what is the role of Islam and its laws in legitimizing and delegitimizing the mobile kin members as well as their immobile properties? So, in matrilineal, mobility is at the center of matrilineal traditions where, once we think of, like, for example, I'll come to it in a minute, but mostly, like, there is a division between, men always can come and go in the Indian Ocean as traders, sailors, captains, and so forth. But women always stay at the property. This is a stereotypical image of, like, the division in terms of gender for the Indian Ocean. Where, so matrilineal sort of works very well as a family system for Indian Ocean. And therefore mobility stands at the center of matrilineal traditions where you have, the concepts like Merantau in the Minangkabau tradition, where the men, when they get, the puberty or like a bulu, or, a late teenage, they are no longer allowed to stay at home. They are kicked out of, home. So you have to go outside and find your own capital, whether economic capital, financial capital, or, social capital, and, through education or commerce and trade, and come back with that capital, which you utilize for your own marriage. So you become a marriageable or marriable man. And similarly, there are other concepts of, that mobility is at the center of these matrilineal communities. And then, whether it's in South Asia, Southeast Asia, or East Africa, where the customs or the local traditions very much emphasize on the, on the concept of mobility. And similarly, that you can find that in the lineage itself, where, the communal identity is often rooted in the idea of mobility, where, some of these communities, like, the Anak Jami, which is in Aceh province in Indonesia, and then the, basically that means children of guests or the people who came from outside, and then, in the Mapila community, the children, the Mapilas, whether are Christians or Jews or Muslims, often identified as the mother's child, so not father's child. So similarly, you find that kind of, mobility being at the center of kinship terms. And then because of this interaction between communities, you also find a lot of hybrid lineages, which is not specific to the matrilineal communities. It is common across the Indian Ocean. But in the matrilineal community, some of these terms sort of, stick or, as project. And within the oceanic context, yeah, thank you. So there are these cross-cultural interactions, between different peoples, and, in all these matrilineal communities all across, you find, multiple ethnicities, or, ethnicity or race is a controversial term, but still, like, different communities being at the center of the this thing. And then the larger division is in terms of, like, mobile men and immobile women. That is a sort of, like, especially for pre-19th century. So in the long distance mobilities, like, you have these communities, and then the inter-regional mobilities where most of these, like, men from these communities traveling between communities. And this is also based on the different occupations, where, one elephant in the room in the Indian Ocean studies is that, before 19th century, Indian Oceans appears to be a very patriarchal space. Very rarely we have any studies looking at the kind of, but historically this is not true, You have a lot of, women traveling before 19th century, either through mercantile ventures, and all sort of, different occupations, like in whether traders, pilgrims, preachers, admirals, and, and then of course the forced labor, domestic slavery, before 19th century. So, what is as a consequence of his, in the matrilineal patterns, you have the matrilineal households that is, stand as the intermediaries for the mercantile ventures. And what happens that through the marriage, for the foreign trader, let's say, you're coming to a strange place or unfamiliar place. The matrilineal household is a entry point for the person through, different networks of trade, religion, polity, and so forth. And the matrilocal practices or matrilocal praxis, so most convenient form of household, where, women stay at the, at their own houses, and men are sort of, they come and go. They are more sort of visitors or guests. And therefore, all the property and so forth belongs to women alone. And this kind of course, creates a bigger problem in these, traditional, conventional historiography of Islam, where, many scholars have started to write that these practices are against, the foundational ethos of, Islam, which should be very patriarchal. So, it also, in terms of inheritance, it was often identified as a, pre-Islamic or as a Jahiliya practices. And these communities, many scholars in the late 18th century, 19th century, they wrote that, these communities have not been properly Islamized. Therefore, they are practicing these things. And they also argued that all these properties should be, properties as well as the members in the, like, almost all these matrilineal households were like big families, right? So you need to identify, the proper owners of these lands as well as the properties, and then you should be dividing according to the fara'id, or according to the inheritance laws of Islam, where men get double share and women to get, only half, which, until then men didn't get any share. So, but then similarly, there were like, other less controversial yet patriarchal arguments in terms of Islam, where with regard to its residential pattern or the matrilocality, or the control over children, where men never had any control over children in these communities, as well as, the questions on the relationship, whether biological and psychological and so forth. And what is interesting is that, like, the colonial courts or lawyers and writers also made the similar arguments. For example, just to give an example, like, while the Islamic authors, mostly Arab or Arab-centered authors, identified this as Jahiliya or un-Islamic, non-Islamic, the colonial Jews, whether the British, Dutch, Portuguese, French, they often identify them as barbaric, primitive, uncivilized, and so forth. So you don't find much, division in that aspect. But what is happening, yeah, thank you. What is happening in this context is that, there is a lot of divisions of property that is happening, the dynamic that is happening within the country, and I'm talking like in a large scale, but, but still, some of the general features that we see is the divisions, many sorts of divisions in terms of, movable property versus, immovable properties, and inherited properties vis-a-vis the earned properties, and ownership vis-a-vis usage. So, like, there you find some of the properties that were undividable being, divided. And this is something that is often identified. Despite of these divisions, some of this is from Nagari Sambilan. My property is my property, and my husband's property is also my property. So even though, in the conjugal or, individual properties, still women had the control, ownership. And then because of the Islam, Islam's importance was very significant in these communities. There were several arguments in terms of counter arguments. So this is in terms of collective vis-a-vis the private properties. So the question of milk and then earned property to be divided, while the collective property or the immovable property not to be inherited. And another technique that is, particularly within the Shafi'i school of law, all these matrilineal communities, Muslim matrilineal communities, follow Shafi'i school of law. So based on that, this idea of waqf al-awlad, or family endowment for, with exclusively for daughters, sort of, stood out. And then, the concepts like, hadiya and gift and so forth also. So I don't have a conclusion because it's a project that I'm starting, but still something that I will end by this, couple of questions is like, these counter arguments or the Islamic legal logic as a latecomer to the whole question, whether is it retaliation in the same coin from the late 18th century onward, when you find, the accommodations of these terms against the accusations of, ridda and kufr and so forth, or is it rooted in a larger history of the expansion of Islam? So I'll conclude there. Thank you very much.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Very many thanks to the Ocean Circularities Program Committee for the wonderful opportunity to present my work at this conference. So my paper will engage with the study of Indian ocean circularities via the archipelagic memory of Creole Bengal. And this work is part of the Island Indias project coordinated by Professor Ananya Jahanara Kabir at King's College London, who's also here with us today. And it's a work in progress as I've just started my research on the transoceanic life worlds of Creole Bengal a couple of months ago. Thus, I will offer a snapshot of the key concerns that I've engaged with thus far. And I would then like to, segue into a discussion with the rest of you. And I look forward to your insights and observations. Okay, well, I've been interested in examining the transoceanic encounters of island-like enclaves along the Hooghly River in Bengal. Now, these enclaves, including Bandel, Chandonnagor, Chinsura, and Serampore, rapidly developed into Portuguese, French, Dutch, and Danish settlements between the 16th and the 19th century. So here are some maps which show, and as you can see, that's Bengal there. Closer look will show the posts where, the Portuguese and the French and the Dutch posted themselves. So that's all along the Hooghly, sitting cheek by jowl. And it was a very compact space, with lots of intercultural synergies going on. So Bengal per se is not an island, but I am looking at it as an island-like enclave which was sort of densely compacted, and in this compact space there were a lot of intercultural encounters that were taking place, about which we are going to talk in a few minutes. Okay, now today, for the purpose of my presentation, I'm going to look at Portuguese Bengal, okay? And I'm going to look at the western coast there along the Hooghly. The Portuguese sort of instituted themselves initially in Hooghly at the beginning of the 16th century, and then, progressively as their power declined, went back to Bandel. So Bandel sort of became very resonant of this Portuguese Creole imaginary in Bengal, which has not been examined in sufficient depth and detail, and I'm trying to do that through my work. Okay, now so you see all these powers, the Portuguese, the Dutch, the Danish, the French, so they entered into complex inter-imperial dialogues with the British colonial capital Calcutta, furthering at the same time Bengal's transcultural exchanges with the Indian Ocean Rim. Now, for the purpose of this presentation, as I was telling you before, I'm going to engage with Portuguese Bengal. Now, my analysis of the discursive and artistic circularities constituting such entangled histories and their creolized life worlds will be predicated upon the memorial and the vocal axes of two early 19th century identity narratives, those of Anthony Firingi, who was a Portuguese Bengali Kobial songster. I'm going to get into the nitty-gritties of Kobial Gan in a little bit, but right now it's just enough for us to know that he was a Portuguese Bengali Kobial songster who lived in Farashdanga, which is modern day Chandanagar. I'll just go back to the previous map. So you can see Chandanagar there. So that's where Anthony Firingi is supposed to have lived for the greater part of his life. There's not much historical evidence available, but through fiction and, the sparse historical records that you sourced on Anthony Firingi's life, it could be established that he lived somewhere near Chandanagar. Okay, and the second figure I'm going to look at is Henry de Rosio, who was a Calcutta-based Anglo-Indian poet and academic of mixed Portuguese ancestry. So his father was Portuguese. He married his father, so de Rosio's father married an English woman, and then they later converted to Protestantism from Catholic Christianity, and de Rosio became an anglicization of de Rosario. So the original Portuguese name was de Rosario, became contracted to de Rosio. So now I will look at two of de Rosio's poems and a couple of Kobial song duels from two Bengali films based on Anthony Firingi. And the names of the films are Anthony Firingi 90, it's just called Anthony Firingi, and it was sort of produced in 1967, directed by Sunil Bandopadhyay. And the other one is a more recent adaptation of Anthony Firingi's life. It's called Jatishwar, which means the reincarnate, and it was sort of directed by Srijit Mukherjee and released in 2014. Okay, now for this purpose, I will deploy a conceptual apparatus interspersing non-territorial paradigms of memory making with sound studies methodologies, and I will thereby trace the subjective lineaments of transoceanic circularity in de Rosio's poems and Firingi's songs, and by doing so, I will demonstrate how the vocal articulations of their creolized modernity enable us to excavate the memorial enclaves of Bengal's material and affective networks with the Indian Ocean world. In other words, my presentation will try and think through the possibilities of exploring, the embodied sonic agency of de Rosio and Firingi's in-between or interstitial story spaces, and I'll do so in order to inaugurate a polyvocal transoceanic poetics. So I will do so in order to inaugurate a polyvocal transoceanic poetics of remembering Creole Bengal and the Indian Ocean world. And here I am deploying the twin semantic impulse of the word remember. So remember as an act of recollection and remember as an act of reassembling. But before going into these details, let me provide you a very quick overview of some conceptual premises which would help as a starting point for my presentation. So the first premise is the argument on the early demise of Creole India advanced by Claude Markowitz in his essay on the political history of Britishness in India. Now, Markowitz attributes the early demise of Creole India to the administrative policies implemented in British Bengal under the Governor Generalship of Lord Cornwallis, 1786 to 1793. Consequently, the colonial historiography of India, infers Markowitz, has been, quote, for a long time characterized by the prevalence of a binary framework, unquote, i.e. British versus Indian, and this marginalized the trans-regional encounters which were spawned forth by other non-British European imperial legacies in India and indeed in Bengal, as for example those of the Portuguese, Dutch, French, and Danish powers, as I pointed out a few minutes ago. Now, Markowitz's observations have been further developed by Ananya Jahanara Kabir to demonstrate how the term Creole is almost, quote, never invoked to describe any aspect of Indian culture and history, unquote. Kabir therefore argues for the need to deploy creolization as a heuristic tool to re-evaluate, quote, histories connecting Indian people with others in the Atlantic and Indian Ocean worlds, unquote. And in order to do so, Indian cultural history, she contends, needs to be deterritorialized, as it has thus far been overwhelmingly told through, quote, a territorial and centralizing perspective. And in her work undertaken for the Creole India project, Kabir explains how the peninsular heartland of India, how India's peninsular heartland complex in shaping, contemporary narratives of Indianness, has been so pervasive that it has withstood complications by exciting new ocean-facing historiographies of India. So our project actually proposes to go back to these ocean-facing historiographies of India, and it proposes Creole Indias in response to this problem in order to consolidate a theoretical and a methodological apparatus which is generated by a non-terrestrial epistemologies to propose an alternative reading, quote, of Indian cultural history as relational and transoceanic rather than centered on the peninsular heartland, unquote. Okay. Now, I will, on that note, very quickly segue into my presentation of the vocal axes. So what I have been trying to do here, among other things, is deploy Murray Schafer's notion of the soundscape. So there are these sound studies methodologies which have been feeding, as I was telling you, into the equation of how a transoceanic sort of encounter can be vocalized. Now, for the purpose of our presentation, what is important are these Dionysiac and Apollonian, conceptual paradigms that Schafer talks about. So he sort of takes off from the work of, these Bauhaus architects in 1920s Germany who were sort of in an interdisciplinary capacity engaging with acoustic designs and were very invested in the materiality of the machine and endowing machines with a subjectivity. So based on that, he traces these two paradigms. So according to the Dionysiac paradigm, now that's the more irrational and subjective paradigm, and the Apollonian paradigm is the one that's sort of associated with harmony, okay? Now, on that note, I'm going to quickly go on to Henry Desrosiers. I've already explained who he was. He was an important progenitor of the Young Bengal movement in Bengal, among others, and we are going to go to two of his poems now, which I'm going to close read. So the first one is Song of the Hindustani Minstrel, okay? And it says, Dildar, there's many a valued pearl in richest Oman sea, but none, my fair Kashmirian girl, oh, none can rival thee. So here he sort of, well, we were having a lot of dialogue on the pearl trade the other day, and here, it is, I think, both the Apollonian and the Dionysiac conceptual paradigms which are coming into play, because you have him charting the geographical scape of, Oman and of the Kashmirian girl. So it's almost like the Creole Bengali soundscape is being extended from Kashmir to Oman. And then, it goes on to this figure of the Dildar, who remains a transmedial interstitial figure between the Apollonian paradigm of harmony and the Dionysiac paradigm of irrationality. Okay, now I'm going to go very quickly through this poem, which is called The Maniacal Widow, right? And the important point that I want to focus on here is on the function of the lute, okay? So the lute, is a musical instrument, right? And here the lute is being used as this instrument to invoke a dead woman's dead lover who is buried in the depths of the ocean. So it's almost as if he is investing on this transoceanic modernity, the imaginary that, transoceanic subjectivity of Creole Bengal is producing in order to advance memory as a palimpsest. So for, those of us, like, we know what the palimpsest is, right? So it's a parchment which has been written over by another parchment. So it's almost a writing that has been written over by something else, yet the traces of the old writing still remains. So if we go on to this poem, it's almost as if the Dionysiac, interpretation of the lute is being prefigured palimpsestically by its Apollonian harmony, right? So on that note, I'm going to quickly go on to Anthony Feringhi, and I will show you a quick sequel on what is known as the Kobigan contest. So the Kobigan, to very quickly summarize, so it's like a verbal duel, okay? And it comprised of 3 parts. The first part was called the Shoki Shambat, where you had religious songs on Radha and Krishna's love stories. So they were like, devotional as well as lyrical songs. The second part was called Bhavani Bisharok, which meant, songs dedicated to the goddess Kali. And the third one is called the Keur, where you have a playful engagement between poets. And that's where the contest starts. I'll play the second video. So if you could kindly help me with that, thank you. Antony has just stood up to contest his rival Bhola Moira, who is Bhola the sweet maker. And this is what he's saying, that even though he is a foreigner, he's well versed in the scriptures. And you can read the translation there.
শিবের নাম ধারণ করে নায়ক ভোলানাথ বাংলাদেশের কবি আসরে তাণ্ডব নৃত্য করে বেড়াচ্ছেন। ভগবতীর শক্তি হতে শিবের উৎপত্তি। তাই আজকে আসরের ভোলানাথকে আমি জিজ্ঞাসা করি, যে শক্তি হতে উৎপত্তি সেই শক্তি তোমার পত্নী কি কারণ? ওহো দেখি ভোলানাথ এর বিশেষ বিবরণ। সমুদ্র মন্থন কালে বিষ পান করেছিলে, তখন ডেকেছিলে দুর্গা দুর্গা বলে, রক্ষা করো আপনি। সেই দিন কি ভুলে তাহারে বলেছিলে জননী? আমি সে ভোলানাথ, আমি সে ভোলানাথ নই রে, সে ভোলানাথ নই, আমি সে ভোলানাথ নই রে, সে ভোলানাথ নই। আমি ময়রা ভোলা হরুর চালা বাগ বাজারে রই, আমি সে ভোলানাথ নই রে, সে ভোলানাথ নই, আমি সে ভোলানাথ নই রে, সে ভোলানাথ নই।
Okay, so what's going on here is, so Bhola is the rival of Antony. So that's one interpretation of Bhola. So he is the musician who is engaged in this Kobigan song duel with Antony. But what Antony says in his verse is my point of interest, because here he goes on to do a sort of a discursive play on Bholanath, because he says that Bhola is Lord Shiva, right? And since this guy's name is also Bholanath, he says that, you should be aware of the legacy that is, being carried in your name, right? But Bhola goes on to say that I don't need that legacy. My legacy is that of the sweet maker. And I want to dissociate myself from the religious legacy of Shiva. Now, the interesting thing that's happening here is that this passage from Shiva and Parvati that Antony sort of alludes to is a passage which is known as the Samudra Manthon in the Vedas and the Upanishads, and it's quite. So what happens is, like Bhola, that is Lord Shiva, consumes the poison of the ocean in order to rescue the gods, the devas, from the asuras, the demons, or even the demigods. And then, because he consumes all this poison, he sort of seeks refuge from Durga, because Durga is the only one who knows something which is called the Dasa Mahavidya. So she knows the 6th Mahavidya of these 10 Mahavidyas, and the 6th Mahavidya can save Bholanath. And that's when, he invokes her. Now, this interstitial space of Durga as wife as well as mother, of Bhola as Bhola the minstrel here, who is a sweet maker, and Bhola, who is Lord Shiva, again propels us to think about these in-between Creole identities that are being generated through, these slippery interstices. So, and also this is being transmedially interpreted on several levels because Bhola's identity is being mutated by Anthony in the course of this song. So Anthony is reinterpreting Bhola's identity as Bhola Lord Shiva, and then Lord Shiva's identity is being palimpsestically reinterpreted by Bhola the sweet maker. So you see how memory is functioning as a palimpsest because Bhola the sweet maker is revolting against the identity of Bhola who is Lord Shiva, and then that is being mutated by this medium, which is the film, and Bhola's identity actually went on to be further mutated in the 2014 sequel, which I don't have time to show you. But there, Anthony gets reincarnated as reborn as a library clerk in modern-day Chandanagar. And then he has his own imaginings of Bhola. So what I think, trying to get at is geoacoustics of creolization. So I am sort of interested in looking at how these slippery interstitial geographies may help us to transmedially translate, a polyvocal acoustics, because here there is no one voice. Here there are several speaking commodities in the Marxian sense who are coming into play. And these, several speaking commodities invite us again to think about the real labor dynamics of the voice of the artist. So it is the voice not as an exchange value, but the voice as a use value with its individual sort of real labor properties, which are, being configured here. And so this geoacoustics poetics of transoceanic creolization is something that I intend to invest in the course of my project, to think through these ambiguities and these interstitial identities in order to generate mythopoesis that might sort of mobilize the dense intercultural synergies of the Hooghly enclaves for remembering a transoceanic epistemology of Creole Bengal that is polyvocal, and that where plurality itself generates different modes of interpretation and different subaltern breaches which cannot be mended by anthropological cobbling. So it is something where you will have to invest in both the Dionysiac and the Apollonian materiality of the voice. So you have to invest in the harmony of the Apollonian materiality as well as the irrationality of the Dionysiac materiality. And of course, rasa theory has also offered us a parallel interpretation, like Dipesh Chakraborty says in his essay, The Nation and the Imagination. Like Ayurveda, it's the science of sensation that sort of sensitizes sound and converts sound into a synesthetic mode. And so the ear here is being channeled through the eye into an organ of tactility. So here you see the synesthetic elements, which are also involved in dissolving binary dichotomy. So we are going about beyond binaries to look at a palimpsestic third space that precisely capitalizes on polyvocality as an in-between space of generating endless possibilities. And on that note, I would like to draw my presentation to a close. Thank you so much for your patience, and I look forward to the discussions. Thanks.
Thank you all for the papers. My question is for Mahmoud. I really enjoyed your paper. This is something I have previously written on in an East African context. And I just wanted to think out loud with you about some of the implications of your paper more broadly and comparatively. It seems to me that there are multiple layers to this question. In East Africa, it comes up in the form of the relationship between the Sharia and customary law under the British. In Mombasa in the 1930s, there are a number of, the British are trying to set up essentially what are called Ngambi in Swahili, these customary councils that will rule according to the customary law of particular communities. It's very opposed by the urban residents of Mombasa, but they do succeed in establishing these in the rural areas among Mijikenda communities. The significance there being that Mijikenda communities are made up of Muslims and non-Muslims. But what you see in some of the newspapers that I studied from the 1930s is that people are very anxious about a woman from one of these communities marrying a Swahili townsman and then divorcing, and there are, depending on what law court she chooses to be seen in, her offspring might then go to be raised with her non-Muslim relatives in the rural areas. So I guess maybe the question for you is, what is the role of the urban and the rural here in terms of some of the dynamics you've seen with these mobile matrilineal communities? Thank you again for the paper.
Thank you again. Interesting paper. And I have a question about the same and a comment on the same issue of matrilineality, which I've always been interested in because the area of northern Mozambique. But I think you need to be sort of listing the Swahili coast as being matrilineal is kind of a little too broadly painting. So I mean, you would need to be more specific. But the other, I guess, the specific thing. It's true that matrilocal marriage fits into the model that you're talking about, but it's not the only, it doesn't have to be that. So if you take an example, Guylaine Leiden's study of trans-Saharan trade, you have, which is highly patrilineal, you have women who are managing their husband's resources while they're away in North Africa trading. Or if you look at 19th century British sailors, the prostitutes with whom they had relationships in towns like Portsmouth and things like that are doing exactly the same thing. So the relationship between men and women is not necessarily, that has to do with managing of resources and staying in one place, is not necessarily strict, only matrilineal. So I think there's some, it's such a broad, and it is fascinating that there are so many of these things, but in terms of the Indian Ocean as a whole, I think it'll be important to break down specifics from one area to another to make sure that we're, that it's not fudging things too much.
Thanks for this excellent panel. I'll just focus firstly on Hideaki's paper, which is coming out, of course, I mean, the question comes out of this discussion. We were having this amazing dinner time discussion yesterday. But I think that your quest for another frame, a frame different from just, say, Japan-India relations, but also layering onto the Indian Ocean frame, you have at the end posited the global frame and the Indian Ocean frame as linked to enable us understand the Kanga. I think the work I've been doing on the Dutch wax is a really interesting mirror reflection of that, because when we think about Vlisco's involvement in Dutch wax textiles, we normally think of an Atlantic, European, African axis, and then within that is folded the Indian Ocean axis through Batavia. So I think that we really need to think about Vlisco and its industrial, processes, development of the roller machines and all that, as something that holds together these separate histories of transoceanic textiles. And I think we must really talk more about this for sure. For Asia, I just had one question at the moment. Of course, there are hundreds, but we must remember that Bhola was the creator of Shondesh, which is after all a Portuguese thing, with the introduction of a certain kind of food. Yeah, but I think we must mention that. And his his grandson-in-law was the inventor of the famous Rasgulla, which also traces back to the introduction of milk-based, this waste way into Bengal by the Portuguese. So I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, actually, I'll follow on the question to Hideaki. And I think this framing is really interesting. I think it's important to emphasize the fact that Japan isn't simply leapfrogging the Indian Ocean, that actually the examples you give and others as well show that Japanese production has been drawn more deeply into the circuits and networks of the Indian Ocean in very significant ways. When we were talking about capitalism earlier, raises some very interesting questions about colonial capitalism, the fact that Britain sees British East African markets sort of disappear in the face of Japanese competition. And of course, the critical nature of these markets to Japanese industrialization leading up to the war and post-war recovery. These are all really, really interesting questions about the interface of Japan and the Indian Ocean region. And my question is actually a very specific one related to that, and that's that if you're looking at Japan and Japanese production being drawn deeper and deeper into the Indian Ocean networks and societies, I wonder if you could speak to the scale of the production for East African markets that's not going directly to East Africa. So if you combine merchants in Kobe, South Asian merchants, excuse me, in Kobe, as well as channels via Bombay, this is a big question. I just wonder if you have a sense of what the scale was of Conga specifically that actually aren't going directly. The volume, yeah. Especially in the 20s and 30s, because we know also it's things going to Zanzibar via Muscat as well. Nate spoke about Congas produced for the Omani market earlier. So anyway, I wonder if you could speak to that question of scale in comparison to sending directly themselves.
Since I have the mic, sorry, one more.
Two questions quickly, one for Isha and one for Mahmood. I mean, it's a terrific panel. Isha, so you talked about, you built a kind of a long arc of voice from very sort of distant past to 2014. So I was thinking, could you also reflect a little bit on the medial qualities? Because you're talking about cinema, you're talking about performance genres, etc., which does something to this, to the voice, to the synesthetic experience around it, etc. That's the question. To Mahmood, which are other than Nair Maccellini. So I had the question is this. So since 19th century, there is a kind of moral censure around matrilineal communities, which works on an external logic where it comes into contact with other kinds of legal frameworks, right? And the crux of that is around non-conformative sexual and property practices. In the context of Islam or Muslim matrilinees, the non-conformative aspects of sexuality is not present as far as I understand. The non-conformative aspects come mainly from property relations, right? So I would like to know, so what is the texture of this confrontation between Islamic legal frameworks and customary practices. And also quickly, and this is a conversation we have had before as well, one of the problems with matrilineal studies is that it's excessive focus on family and household relations, almost kind of neglecting other developments which have taken place in gender studies. For example, can we think of confounding gender itself as, let's not think about 18th century, 19th century, and 20th century frameworks around gender as the same. And what I find fascinating is the way in which you use mobility, you think about language, you think about work, etc. And I think those are really interesting ways to go about it. But I just want you to push yourself a little bit to also think about gender in itself as, this I think is something which I've talked already, but please bear with me.
Okay, we really out of time, so maybe we'll have
the last two quick questions, please. And then we'll give
So
them the
I
chance.
want to pick up on the question of matrilineal and also combine a couple of the papers here. First of all, the classic location of matrilineal in Africa is Central Africa. It's not by the coast. It's the whole matrilineal belt from the Congo across through to Mozambique and so on. And so it doesn't necessarily correlate with the things you're talking about. And also the critical thing in matrilineal is the mother's brother. Matrilineal is not about the absence of men. It's about a different construction about the relations between men and women and households and property. And the mother's brother is a critical figure in most of these places. Some of your cases, like Ned was saying, I think are not actually matrilineal. You mentioned Sakalava. They're not matrilineal. But in the 1990s, the Japanese were very present in this region. They were on shipping boats, large shipping boats, collecting masses of fish and shrimp and so on. And the Japanese sailors were stopping in Majanga and other ports in Madagascar. And guess what? They were shacking up with Malagasy women, Sakalava women, and they were having kids. And then they left again, right? So that's not matrilineal. That's just a matter of what happens in ports of trades when sailors come through. And, they forgot, most of them forgot about the children. Occasionally there was somebody who really made the connection and kept it up with Japan. But the point about it is it's about descent, it's about relations between parents and children primarily, more than it's about property in the first instance, I would say. Finally, on the other paper, I want to say, why with all these wonderful Hindu gods are you going to Nietzsche and Dionysus and Apollo? And maybe your paper was a little too Dionysian and not enough Apollonian.
Maybe we can give them 5 minutes to respond. We start.
Well, yeah, thank you so much. So as to the volume, it's quite difficult because we don't have, enough source. That's why it's very difficult to calculate. So, and to be honest, I don't have I have no idea. But then especially the things going to very difficult is because if you're passing through the Bombay, and when these goods are received in Mombasa or Zanzibar, they are counted as the import from the British India. Then you cannot find out, you cannot trace back where how many % of Japanese textile exist or not. So therefore, one of the things which I can rely on is kind of like almost like an impression from the which I can find in the observation, contemporary observation, which something I quote today. So the estimation of the volume is quite difficult. So so if so, then probably the volume of Japanese products will be much higher than the statistics shows. That is the what I can say now. And then layer thing, and about the Dutch print, I'm totally agree with you. And why I try to consider the issue of the framework is because I have some kind of like anxiety the framework of the Indian Ocean world. In other words, more and more, like, this conference, we talking about the Indian Ocean, and we can deepen our consideration, our understanding, and then we can find out more diversity. But if you step back and keep distance and then look at us, maybe we can form some kind of a single understanding of the Indian Ocean if you look from the distance, if you're not the specialist. So I try to be conscious always to fluctuate the framework of the Indian Ocean as much as possible and as far as I can do. So in that sense, the case of case of Kanga, for example, like if you can put several layer of the for example, like a Bombay cloth, and then like a Frisco or cloth, and then also Japanese Kanga. So you can find out the different spatial extent of these each layers. So if you look from the top, you can find out quite fluctuate a picture. So this is one of the way to tackle with this kind of like a solidification of the concept of the Indian Ocean. Yeah, okay, I will stop. Thank you.
All right. Thank you for the wonderful questions. I'll try to combine some of the questions in terms of the concerns or the doubts. I'll say at the outset that, even though, the practices like such as whether the Japanese or the British sailors, marrying or having prostitutes, or even not having any marital relationship, but still having, exploiting. What I'm looking at is not about, whether this kind of promiscuous or, different sort of relationship, rather the way, whether the, in terms of the praxis, the way they whether they conceptualize collectively and defend it, so that is what makes, this community is definitely important. So of course, this sort of, and also in the early, social anthropological literature coming from the Britain, this was the main argument against the earlier, classical anthropological works, including, Lewis Morgan and so forth, where people try to call it in terms of, the, organized form of brothel system where, all this matrilineal, especially if you're calling or if you're trying to identify them prehistorically, which many social anthropologists did. So rather what I say, like, the prehistorical aspects, as well as this sort of, multiple polyandry, polygamy, and the matrilocality and sort of, nuances, rather than the living communities in these places and the ways in which they collectively defend the practice, and then identification within. So whether matrilineal is a matrilocality, all these terms are more, outside to these communities, but still, like, what are the terms and etymologies they employ in order to defend what they have been practicing, in which women have more, or the social system that women are at the center. And I also agree with your point on, definitely on breaking down, the categories, which I also try to do in my research, both regionally, thematically, and different patterns, whether, regions varying from matrilocality to, in some places, even though the community identify themselves as matrilineal, but still, it's more sort of, it's not about lineage, but it's more about, the residential pattern. So this sort of like, thematic as well as, the regional variations is something definitely that I'm looking. And on the question of, urban, rural division, yeah. So definitely this is something, come across once we look at, from the framework of Indian Ocean. Most of these communities, like, either directly or indirectly influenced or, making their livelihood on the basis of the ocean, these are the coastal cosmopolitan communities, right? So the urban, in that sense, is very, very much at the center of the matrilineal communities, but not always, though. Like, for example, the Minangkabau community, the largest matrilineal community, is not a coast-based community. It's rather like, in the uplands, in the regions like Bukit Tinggi, where they are not necessarily like a coastal community, but still their livelihood, the agriculture and so forth, is very much part of the urban culture and the ways in which the community is coming. So it is like this interesting division, whereas in the places like coastal South Asia or the coastal South India, both east and west, you see that most of these matrilineal communities are only in the coastal side, not in the inland agrarian area. So
towards the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century in Bengal. So you had something like, the Brahmo Samaj, for instance, founded by Ram Mohan Roy, who sort of interspersed, Western Christian paradigms with new rereadings of the Vedas and the Upanishads. So these experimentations functioned as palimpsests of each other. I.e., a Dionysiac and Apollonian appreciation of music functioned as a palimpsest to Indian classical ragas. So it's in consonance with the Creole Bengali sort of paradigm of experimentation. And in response to your question about the medial registers that were being, shall I end it at that? Okay.
Well, thank you very much.